I was one of a group of friends, all drinks in our hands, early 20s, gathered around a campfire at a Renaissance festival. Now, several of us had once camped next to a professional fire eater, and he'd taught us just enough to get into trouble. That history is probably what brought about the next idea. 4 of us should gather in a circle around the campfire, each take a mouthful of fuel and blow it into the center, creating this epic, immense fireball. Does this sound like a good idea to you? I have absolutely no excuses beyond youth and alcohol for thinking that it was. I took a mouthful of fuel. Someone handed me a towel to wipe my face, my hands, free of any residuals, and there was only one problem. They'd been using that towel earlier, and it was saturated with both water and Coleman fuel. And so I wiped a layer of an incredible flammable fuel oil over my face. We did the trick, and the fire backed up. It lit my face on fire, and when I went to put my face out with my hands, it lit my hands on fire as well. The next thing that I remember is dumping several gallons of water over my head, and as I'm washing the water up over my face, I'm feeling my skin roll up underneath my fingers the way you'd roll up a rug, and I'm dropping it on the ground in front of me. Have you ever noticed in high-stress situations that our brains work a little differently? If you've ever been through a traumatic moment, then you might recognize the feeling that memory doesn't seem to go in a linear, narrative, straightforward fashion. Instead, it's this collection of crisp snapshots and moments of threat assessment. I wasn't going to be able to exit that threat assessment mindset until I felt safe again. But the nurses in the ER at the burn center never actually went past my physical symptoms to ask how I was doing. Their words would have meant the world to me, even something as simple as, "You're looking pretty freaked out right now. What are you most worried about?" Because those words never happened, 16 hours later, when I finally worked up the courage to look in a mirror, I still felt alone and I still felt terrified. Now, the fire-eating disaster was not the first, or even the 5th, time that I had needed urgent medical attention for something. Sprains, strains, stitches, kneecap on the wrong side of my leg. I eventually concluded that I sucked at situational risk assessment, and just maybe I should actually have some medical training before I tried to survive the rest of my life. So I became an EMT and then a nurse, working the last 20 years in various types of acute care medicine. As I worked at both the bedside and in leadership positions, I began to study trauma from the perspectives of both a patient and a healthcare provider. I've developed a lot of training programs for both medical systems and other organizations. And a lot of what I teach on is communication and connection failures, oftentimes being heavily due to the fact that we don't understand how people's minds work differently when we're stressed. When a situation changes, then the tools that we use for those situations need to change as well. For example, you should take a fire extinguisher to a trash can fire. But if the entire house is on fire, the fire extinguisher is the wrong tool for the job. In a similar vein, we should take empathy to situations where additional emotional connection will improve the outcome or strengthen the connection with another person. But we shouldn't take empathy to situations that are already a firestorm of emotions. It's the wrong tool for the job. Empathy means that we put ourselves in someone else's shoes. We try to imagine their feelings and their perspectives so that we can connect more with them, perhaps support them more. But I'd like you to consider the idea that sometimes empathy isn't the solution. sometimes it's actually part of the problem. As the critical care nurse that I became, what do you think is going to happen to me if I first try to put myself in the shoes of the person that we just gave a cancer diagnosis to? And then I try to imagine the thoughts and the feelings of the parents whose 3-year-old child just died in our ER after being struck by a car, before I go home that night to my own 3-year-old. And then I come back the next day and I do it again. In these types of situations, my bringing empathy in as my tool is creating this cascade of emotions within me that actually makes it harder for me to be present, doing an effective job, supporting these people and their loved ones at the time they need me most. In traumatic situations, combining empathy and trauma is a bit like combining amateur fire eaters and alcohol. There's a high risk for injury when they mix. Those nurses at the burn center, they weren't being callous or uncaring. It's just that they saw terrible things on a regular basis. And they didn't want to imagine themselves in the shoes of a young woman who just burned 2/3 of her face off. And in order to be more caring, in order to have said the words I still wanted to hear at that time, they didn't need more training in empathy. They needed training in compassion. Compassion is different than empathy, and that difference is important because compassion is compatible with stress and trauma in a way that empathy is not. Let me describe it a different way. Imagine that we are standing at the end of a dock, and we see someone in the water. They're in trouble. We recognize they're drowning. Empathy. I try to put myself in that person's position. I imagine their thoughts, their feelings, what would I want, and I jump into the water to help them. I might be able to help them, but any lifeguard will tell you that jumping in the water with a distressed person also carries a very high risk of injury. But what if, instead of jumping into the water with that distressed person, what if I instead intentionally took a step back and I gave myself room to think critically about a solution? Just a tiny half step back from those emotions. And I reach to the side and I grab a life preserver and I throw that to them while simultaneously yelling for somebody to bring more help. Compassion still cares, but it also recognizes that our brains in a stressful situation are great at threat assessment and not so good at complex considerations of emotions. So if our brains need simple steps when stressed, compassion as a tool asks only 3 questions. Is there distress? Can we identify the exact nature of that distress? And can we then use our skills or our knowledge to somehow alleviate or address that distress? I'm going to paint this out in a different kind of picture. It's another personal story, and much like the burn story, you know I come out okay in the end, so hang in there with me, okay? Besides, this story has a better ending. Unlike the last one, which ended with unmet needs, this one ends with answered. This is me just a few years ago, give or take. Okay, fine, this is me in my mid-20s. Single with some very interesting hobbies. You may notice some prominent features in these photos. These pictures were taken just a couple years before I had a double mastectomy. And it doesn't take imagination to recognize that the young woman who's in these photos might have had a little bit of distress associated with a breast cancer surgery. Now, the educational photos that were provided to me looked like this. Oh dear, those are more intimidating even when you supersize them. Much like the education that was offered to me at the burn center, these photos address the surface needs of patient care, but they don't go any deeper than that. Probably for the exact same reason. Nobody wanted to imagine themselves in the shoes of a breast cancer patient to look at the effectiveness of these photos as education. So if empathy isn't going to really help us here, can compassion be a better tool? Well, we already answered the first question. What about the second? Can we identify the exact nature of the distress? Now, if someone had empathetically tried to imagine my fears, they would have gotten some of them right, and others they would have missed entirely. But the nice thing about compassion is we don't have to guess at another person's thoughts, because compassion asks questions. Had someone asked me about my fears, they would have found out that whereas the breast cancer surgery itself relieved most of my fears about dying, it simultaneously left me with other fears. I was worried that this surgery would cost me some of my femininity. I was worried that I had an entire closet filled with really amazing belly dancing costumes that were just going to go to waste. And I was a little concerned that I was going to have to start every dating conversation with, "Hi, I'm Katelyn. It's nice to meet you. Hope you're not a boob guy." And then underneath all of that was the fear that I was going to potentially affect the health of my children, or potentially make it so that my bond with them wasn't as strong because I'd never have the experience of breastfeeding. So for me, a trauma-informed, compassion-based resource would not look like a headless torso picture seeming to focus on the scars. It would look like this. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs in a way that he probably never pictured it, because this photo addresses my need for safety before asking me to process complex information. This photo addresses the fact that I need reassurance as well as information. This is the kind of picture that I wanted anyone facing breast cancer to have available for them. But part of compassion means acknowledging that my fears might not be your fears, and therefore my answers might not work for you. So I gathered together a medical team and a production team and about 50 breast cancer patients, and then I partnered with an amazing photographer by the name of Joseph Lanashki, and together we started asking questions. For 3 years, we asked questions, and we collected all of the fears and threats that we could find that were facing breast cancer patients. 38 of us bared our scars, and we partnered those photos with information and hope. The resulting book and outreach project, Beauty After Breast Cancer, is now used internationally to support thousands of other scared people facing breast cancer. There were a lot of gutsy people that participated in this project, and I want to just give you a brief feeling for how compassion and questions specifically helped us to create something better. Kathy, what were you scared of? I was frightened that I would never look normal again, that everyone would only look at me and see cancer. Tony, what were you scared of? I was afraid that I would lose my individuality to this disease, that I'd become helpless. Unlikely. Brett, what were you most worried about? I was scared that other people would go through the same experience that I went through, but that my story wouldn't have carried any meaning. They would still be facing the same hurdles without guidance. Brett went on to found the Male Breast Cancer Coalition. And Laura, what was your biggest threat? I'd been treating my body like my enemy instead of like my hero returning from war for my life. Will I still be strong? Will I still be sexy? Will I still be a good mother? Will I still be lovable? Will I still be me? When we speak to the threats that face people, then we give them the power to exit that survival-based mindset and become full partners in their care. And this saves lives. Now, I'd like to finish by talking about us. The science of compassion is actually very complex. It involves using trauma science and cognitive science and crisis communication techniques to optimize outcomes for high-stress situations. But the core of compassion is simple, because it's about our need as human beings to feel seen and heard and understood. That's what I wanted as a burn patient. That's what the breast cancer patients wanted as well. That's what helped us to feel safe and supported. I've been at the bedside of probably about 100 births and more than 100 deaths. And from the first breath we take until the last, we never stop wanting to feel heard and understood. With compassion, you have the power to make this possible. Compassion doesn't need you to imagine being me. Compassion doesn't want you to suffer to gain understanding. Compassion doesn't expect that my answers will work for you or yours for me. Compassion simply asks us to relieve distress and meet the needs of other people. Compassion asks questions. And when you ask the questions that you need to gain a true understanding of another person's experience, the potential for finding common ground, resolution, or healing is limitless. Thank you.